begin by welcoming everybody. My name's John Gabriel, and I'm the current chair of the Oral History Society. We're delighted to be co-hosting this second series of the In Dialogue with the Institute of Historical Research. I would like to thank Juanita and Claire Langhammer for their help and support. I think the connections with the Institute are very evident in tonight's event. So we're really delighted to have Isra Hussein and Christian Morris from the Young Historians Project. I'm sure they'll talk about it in more detail in a minute, but the project, as I understand it, it emerged from the outcomes of a History Matters conference at the Institute of Historical Research in 2015, which highlighted the staggeringly low numbers of history students and teachers of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain. So the purpose of YHP was and is to encourage more people of African and Caribbean heritage to become engaged with and encouraged to rediscover underrepresented aspects of Black history and to develop the skills to become the historians of the future. Our discussant this evening is Juanita Cox, and Juanita is herself perfectly placed to play this dual role, as she's not only a member of the IHR and working on an AHRC-funded oral history project on the Windrush scandal, but she's also a trustee of the Oral History Society and a plenary speaker at our annual conference last year on the theme of home. So just by way of background, for those of you who haven't attended these events in the past, to say a little bit very briefly about what the purpose of the In Dialogue series is from an OHS point of view. As the OHS celebrates our 50th anniversary this year, we were born in 1973. In 2023, we're all too aware of the lack of visible diversity in the organization. We want to know why that is and what can be done about it. And organizations like YHP may have some answers that we need to explore as an organization in order to become more inclusive and responsive to groups like YHP. I'd also add that we hope that in the course of our discussions, there will be opportunities to discuss what the Oral History Society provides and the support it can offer, to see if there are ways in which we can support the work of the Young Historians Project. And we can talk a little bit about that towards the end. All of the groups and organizations in this series are ones with whom we want to strengthen our relationships. We want them to continue into the future. We don't want this to be a one-off event. And we want to ensure as an organization that Black history is not just an afterthought or an add-on in terms of the work of the OHS, but integral to the work of the society. And with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Christian, our first speaker, who's a postgraduate student at Warwick University. Christian.
Thank you very much. Hi all, I'm Christian. I'm a postgraduate student at the University of Warwick, and I've been volunteering at the Young Historians Project for the past year now. So I look forward to telling you guys about some of the work that we've been doing over the past few years and how we consider oral history to be an important aspect of the work that we do. So I'm just going to show you the PowerPoint we've created for you guys today to explain and detail who YHP is. So just to tell you a little about ourselves, reiterating what John has said, we are a non-profit organization encouraging Afro-Caribbean and British historians aged 16 to 25 about Black British history. Why has YHB became a thing? It's because of staggering statistical research that informed us that only 3 Black history teachers were informed in 2016. History was also the most unpopular undergraduate subject for Black students in 2011 to 12, with 1.8% of the cohort being Black. In YHP, we stand in solidarity with Black communities and diasporas and continue their struggles. Over 30 members have contributed countless hours and times, developing skills in public speaking, writing, web, and graphic design, providing public resources for children and the older generation about the importance of Black British history, and advocating why Black communities and identities are important to Britain. So today we'll be discussing some of the projects that we are focused on that include oral history and detail why oral history is very important and integral to understanding the experience of Black people within the UK. I'm just going to hand it over to Israel, who can develop this further.
So I first wanted to start by detailing some of the organizations that have been integral to our work. So we work in a network of creatives, researchers, historians, archivists, and filmmakers who have helped YHP members develop skills in video editing, like the Rainbow Collective, public speaking, like Everyday Muslim, who have given us access to their archives, like the Black Cultural Archives, and who have provided workshops in teaching YHP members how to do archival research, like the George Padmore Institute. So we don't work in isolation. We try to reach out to wider community. Why oral history? So what oral history means to YHP is very complex. And I wanted to start by explaining this point of our idea that interviewees are living archives. So our perspective is that it's our responsibility to capture the stories of the elders in our communities before they disappear or before they become even more underground and overlooked. So not only do they provide their histories to us through interviews, but they also share images, documents, and really valuable perspectives that might have continued to be overlooked. And we feel that oral history is really important in democratizing knowledge production. So it empowers communities whose histories are overlooked in the national curriculum or mainstream media, or just general conversations around history, to share their stories and produce their own projects and share their own knowledge. And it's also really important to us because the whole process of oral history brings together different generations and people of different backgrounds and encourages the younger community to learn about their heritage. In terms of the dynamic between the interviewer and the interviewee, it's really valuable, building connection and making people inspired. So I'm going to introduce the A Hidden History, African Women and the British Health Service project, which was our last project, which ran from 2018 to 2021. So it came about because of the 70th anniversary of the NHS approaching, and we felt that the mainstream narrative was based around the Windrush generation and Caribbean women, and we wanted to introduce the perspective of African women into the story of the history of the NHS. So the Hidden History Project aims to shed light on the experiences, contributions, and achievements of African women in the healthcare sector in Britain during 1930 to 2000. And we found a lot of absences in the official archives to do with this time period. So we've used oral history and intergenerational dialogue to fill in those gaps. So our project outputs were a documentary series and an online exhibition. So the documentary series is 8 episodes based on these themes. So it's structured around interviews that YHP members did with around 30 women, discussing their early lives, their careers, their experiences with racism in the NHS, activism, and community and identity. And the YHP online exhibition is hosted on our website. And we've done things like make an ebook, an interactive map, a historical timeline on the history of the NHS and how that overlaps with Black history, a glossary of key terms, gallery, and a biographical section for the African women in the health service before 1950, and an interview bank where you can learn all about our project participants and see clips of their interviews. And this is just a peek at the timeline. And we felt it's like really important to make resources that people can learn from, people can access online at their own pace. And it ends in the 2000s. And the interview bank. And these are all the women that we interviewed that have participated in our project. And here's a short clip from the migration episode of the documentary.
After World War II, many industries, including the healthcare sector, had begun to decline due to the widespread post-war staff shortages, which not only affected public life in Britain, but also the economy. With more nurses leaving Britain than coming in, and with the launch of the NHS, the National Health Service, in 1948, policy changes were implemented to encourage immigration to supplement the labour needed in the NHS and in other sectors in Britain. Between the 20th and 21st centuries in the UK, the total number of African migrations increased from 5,000 to 30,000 per year, many of whom had fled countries such as Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone, all experiencing social and political turmoil during the mid to late 20th centuries. But while many aspiring migrants held on to the promise of better education and career prospects in Britain, in some cases the reality did not meet their expectations in the country they now called home. This episode is their story.
Arrived here on the 12th of January 1959. Had seasickness from the minute I entered the ship until I arrived at Liverpool. My reason for coming here was to train as a nurse and go back to Ghana to open a maternity home. When I first arrived here, I was expecting the weather to be like it was in Africa, nice and warm.
I came to this country in 1972. The British Council met me actually at the airport. My story really starts before I came to this country because I was brought up in Zimbabwe, which was then Rhodesia. And my father was a political activist. I was brought here by Amnesty International. Somehow, Amnesty got to find out about my family. And I came, and then like 3 months later, my sister came.
So that's just a sneak peek of our documentary. And now I'm going to hand over to Christian to introduce the next project. Oh, you're muted, Christian.
Very sorry about that. So a project that was worked on just before this one was the Black Liberation. It's with the Black Liberation Front. This was a liberation front that was founded in 1971 and operated until 1973. This liberation front organized African Liberation Day, established supplementary schools, bookshops, and affordable housing for Black communities. And so we, YHB, created a documentary titled We Are Our Own Liberators. We felt it was important to provide agency to the members of the group that focus on developing links to liberation struggles and advocating and illustrating the political activism of Black British communities. The Liberation Front desired for agency against police brutality and aimed to cultivate a community in support of Pan-Africanism and socialism. Subsequently, we interviewed 9 members, including the sister group called the Fasimbas, asking them to explain their experiences of creating the Liberation Front and also why the Liberation Front was disbanded. These focused on our main themes of community, solidarity, and resilience, which were a part of the documentary series. So now we're just going to provide you a short video explaining some of the being an expert of the documentary.
PLF was Pan-African nationalist Black organization. It was underpinned by certain elements of Marxism and Leninism. There's certain elements of social realism, or there's elements of liberation theology. There was a whole idea of an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist focus.
Challenging the old arrangements, you know, you weren't letting people call you colored anymore. You weren't letting people call you Negro anymore. You know, you were like, we're the Africans, this is who we are. Who don't like it, tough luck for them, you know.
It's made us, helped us to a position where we don't just take these things as they said to us. We need to look at why is this happening? What is the background? What is the history?
You saw yourself both as a subjugated group, also a group with the potential to free yourself from the subjugation.
We were really, as a group, just kind of waking up to political consciousness. Well, of course, that wasn't going to be considered dangerous.
Underpinning all of our activism, all our programs, was a radicalism that was saying, this is what the experiences we're having in the United Kingdom is not what we want to change it.
So that was just a short excerpt showing our documentary project that was focusing on the experiences of the main members of the Black Liberation Front. After this, we also created an exhibition for the community and the public to see the documentary and experience and talk to some of the members of the Liberation Front. We thought this was very important as a form of public history for the community, children and people of an older age to experience and engage with Black history and understand the value and importance of political activism. This is a symbolic, we found that the Black Liberation Front was symbolic of that. as it was a very important community within London at the time.
And you can watch this documentary on the YHP website and find all the other learning resources based around this research on the YHP website as well. Now I'm going to share with you YHP's approach to oral history. So how we approach oral history interviews is by reaching out to the communities that we research and trying to build relationships and networks within those communities. So for the African Women in Healthcare project, we worked a lot with the Ghana Nurses Association and the Nigerian Charitable Nurses Association to find people to interview or find pictures of women who are working with it within the NHS during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And yeah, they were very helpful. So a lot of YHP's work with oral history is very grassroots, word of mouth, and just engaging with the public. And we provide a recording agreement with the interviewees to help them understand what's going to happen with the interview files, the recording, the transcript, and to help them understand the process of the interview. And YHP members have been trained through workshops with the Black Cultural Archives to understand how to structure an interview, how to film an interview. And we go through with each other a list of questions we want to ask, how we want to frame the conversation, how to be ethical, fair, sensitive to our interviewees. And we also do schools outreach, and in our workshops, we try to teach the children about the importance of oral history and what kind of potential oral history interviews can have in terms of building all these amazing projects and learning more about the older generation. Like someone who could be your neighbor has access to all this information that you probably would never have imagined before. So we go into schools, teach them about our projects, and try to help them understand all about oral history and Black history, of course. How you can access YHP's work is through our website, our Twitter, and our Instagram, where we post clips and pictures and updates about all our projects. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Isra and Christian. I didn't get a chance to introduce Isra, but I should tell you that Isra is an undergraduate student, final year undergraduate student at UCL. Is that right, Isra? And presumably you're doing a degree in history, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So I'll hand over now to Juanita, who's going to respond to your presentation and raise some questions before we open it up for wider discussion with other participants in the group. You on mute.
Thank you. No, I'm here. I was just waiting for the PowerPoint to disappear. But thank you, John, for inviting me to be the discussant. I just found it actually really interesting with the way Christian started off kind of contextualizing the importance of the Young Historians Project, particularly in reference to the very small number of Black history teachers that there are, in terms of the unpopularity of history as a subject in school. I think he said there was maybe just over 1% of students who take history as a subject. But I also like the way that he spoke about history as thinking about oral history. What did it mean to the white Young Historians project, in saying that the interviewees were like living archives, and understanding the kind of importance of capturing those stories before those histories were lost, both in terms of, obviously successive generations moving on, but also in terms of the fact that those voices are quite often silenced. I think what I thought was quite interesting is, obviously I do a lot of oral history research, but images, and I don't use images and documentation material as much. And I noticed that obviously with Christian and Isra, you showed that you use documentation and images quite a lot, and I think that's really valuable. And I think, the understanding that you have about the importance of knowledge production, and that it kind of fills the void, the silence that's out there when it comes to Black history. The whole idea that Black history is just once a month in October, and even then, what Black history do we hear? So it's really important to get the perspective and the experiences of the community. But something I'd never thought about before, which you brought up, which I just thought was so fascinating, was when you said that it brought different generations together, that you were really interested in this idea of building connections between the different generations. And I guess I hadn't really thought of that as important, or at least I feel from what you're saying that it highlighted the importance of that, of doing that, particularly within migrant communities, where you've got a parent that's been born and brought up elsewhere from the child that may be born in the UK and experiencing a different culture from the parent. And actually quite often you'll see that within those first and second generations, there's a lot of maybe friction because of the lack of understanding that goes on about the different cultures. So I really enjoyed, and I thought it was really important that was something that you focus on. And that you saw it as a way of kind of passing on knowledge between the generations. The other thing I thought was really interesting was when you started talking about, the project you did on the 70th anniversary of the NHS, and recognizing that, in fact, the mainstream narrative is, when they're talking about the representation of Black people within the NHS, we're always talking about Caribbean people, and that's so true. And I was actually really fascinated by the clip you shared. I think the First Lady opened up talking about, I think she arrives in 1959, and she's talking about the cold and so forth. But I thought that was really interesting because it sort of overlaps with the work that I do, in that within the Windrush scandal, everybody thinks it's just the Windrush that's been impacted. And really our focus does tend to be on the Caribbean community, but the more research I'm doing, the more and more I'm becoming convinced that we need to look beyond that, because clearly the African community also arrived in that period before 1973. But I think a lot of people have this kind of perception that the African community arrived much later than, the Caribbean community, whereas actually there's been a continuation of migration to the UK from the early period onwards. So I thought that was really important. And I also wondered as well, I thought it was quite interesting to think about the kind of timeline of this, because the oral histories that have been done on Caribbean nurses in the NHS reflects the periods in which the Caribbean community have dominated. And whereas this shift now to look at the African community kind of reflects, actually, we are living in a moment where the African community is growing and becoming very significant, whereas actually the Caribbean population is shrinking. And I think at the moment it only figures at around somewhere like 600,000 people. So it is really important that there is a shift in focus, or an adding to the focus of the African community. And I just hadn't really thought about the role of Africans in the NHS. So yeah, that was really important. The other thing that sprung to mind, I guess, was, and I thought I would ask you about, in connection to that, is thinking about who's doing the interviews. you know, did you feel it needed to be people from the African community, or could it have been anybody? I just wasn't sure whether the significance of what of the Young Historians Project was that it was people of the African community interviewing members of the African community, and if you thought that that was really important. But I also was interested in issues of perspective. I mean, obviously linked to that was the issue of perspective, particularly when you were talking about the Black Liberation Front. And I'm thinking about histories that have been done in the past on the Black community, quite often have been used against the Black community, as opposed to reflecting a positive light on the community. And I thought that was particularly applicable when you were talking about the Black Liberation Front, and obviously in terms of their political activism, and seeing that, you know, the importance of liberation theory and Marxism, and all those ways of thinking, and the kind of emerging of their kind of political consciousness, but that consciousness being considered dangerous, I thought was actually, that was really fascinating as well. And I wondered again if who interviews them was important, that whole issue of perspective and how you view the activities of that group. You know, I thought that was really important. And then, of course, you spoke about the approach to oral history, and I thought that was really interesting too. I guess I originally had thought, but I was thinking, reflecting on how you might have gone about it, I thought perhaps it would have just been, it might have been largely word of mouth based on your own parents, you know, who your own parents would have known within the NHS and that kind of thing. And I, you know, I'm not aware or hadn't been aware of the associations, the country affiliated associations. So like the Nigerian Charitable Nurses Association or the Ghanaian Nurses Association. And I wondered in that whether you found that once you'd met one person, there was a kind of snowball effect where they would then introduce you to other people, or maybe how that had worked. And then, yeah, I think you were talking also about, you know, the workshops, and that you've been provided training by the Black Cultural Archives. And I wondered if you could say more, a bit more about that actually, in terms of how intensive the training was, how long it was, you know, is it like a day's workshop, or is it subject specific? You know, I mean, do you do workshops that are just on the interview process, or do they do workshops on GDPR as well, on the type of equipment that should be used and that sort of thing? And then the other thing that I really loved was the fact you then go on to do outreach to schools. So I was wondering there as well, what sort of response you got from schools, especially given that the type of subjects that you were bringing to them were not subjects that would be on the curriculum. And also in terms of, like, when you were talking about the Black liberation, the work that you've done on that, how schools kind of received that in terms of the political activism and the kind of ideas that are being espoused in terms of political consciousness. And then I think the one thing that I didn't get maybe was what you do with those archives. So I understand what you do in terms of then, you know, using them to put them on your website, sharing clips and creating documentaries. I think you said you produced like ebooks and, you know, had online exhibitions and documentary series and things like that. But I wondered where the original recordings would be stored. So whether the Young Historians Project has some of keep the actual original, unedited, unredacted, you know, version of the recordings. So yeah, I don't know if Christian or Isra maybe take it in turns to respond to some of those thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Juanita. I made a quick note of them. I don't know if you managed to get hold of all the points, Christian and Isra, but have a go.
No, I managed to get quite a lot of them down. Well, quite a lot, but they're very interesting and important questions to ask. I think, where should we start? I guess I'll just respond to some of the things that you found interesting first. I quite liked that you saw the value of the creation of the project, and how the information that we provided kind of intensified the importance of creating that project, because the statistics that we were provided with are very alarming. I think that was one of the reasons as to why I joined the organization in the first place, because I never saw myself as, you know, that number, that 1.8% of Black students that was at undergraduate level that were studying history. And then to also see only around 16 PhD students that were Black being accepted on PhD programs. So I thought, at least before I finished my undergraduate studies, that I contribute to something related to that. And if I'm not still studying history, at least I'm creating an archive or supporting an archive that encourages students to study Black history, and also Black students that want to study history and encourage them to do that. So I'm very appreciative that you see the value in that. I think it's very interesting that you talked about like this dismantling of the Windrush generation. And I think that's very important to expand the meaning of Blackness and who identifies as Black for the public, especially when we are engaging with these historical sources and producing these historical sources. The diaspora is expansive, and it's comprising of people from many areas around the globe, but also nationally. I think one thing I also noticed as well, the Windrush generation is a huge focus for Black British history, but also people in communities located in London. So it's very important for us to, as we have suggested and you have rightly noted, to focus on the silences and the nuances that are not typically represented or discussed about. And yes, dismantling the Windrush generation is one example of that. I think one question, I think I'll try to attempt to answer, and that was who can conduct these interviews and which perspectives are important when conducting these interviews with these communities of the past and of the present. And I find it very interesting because I myself, I was born here, but my parents traveled over from Zimbabwe in the late 90s, and I'm also conducting oral history. And I've even questioned myself of whether I have the authority or the important perspective of interviewing these people. And I think what I've understood is it's more important to let these people experiences and the sources to speak for themselves, rather than to have, I guess, direct control and insert my experience and my perspective within the oral history itself. And I think it's reiterating that point of these people and experiences and communities being a living archive. They are the ones that are talking. They are the perspectives that are very important. And I think when it comes to considering who can conduct these interviews and who should be conducting these interviews, I think it's more about the agency of the interviewees themselves and how they are the talking point rather than the person conducting the interview themselves. But it's a very interesting and difficult question to answer. I don't know if you would all agree with me or Israel herself, so what would you say, Israel?
So I joined YHP after all the oral history interviews were completed for the African Women in Healthcare project, so I didn't get to do any of the interviewing firsthand. But for the question, of if it matters who's doing the interviewing. I can imagine that being interviewed by someone from a similar background to you would help in kind of creating a more comfortable environment, or like creating a safe space to discuss really sensitive issues like the racism they faced while they were working in the NHS, or like difficult experiences they may have had, or even the fact that a lot of YHP members are women might have helped them feel more comfortable when they were sharing like these kind of sensitive topics whilst doing the interviews. But most YHP members are from like African, Caribbean backgrounds or mixed heritage. So I think we all have like a sense of shared understanding or like relating to each other. And we did do research before starting the project into these histories. So there was like an understanding of the topic before interviewing.
So that's interesting. Can I ask you things like to what extent you had to do research? Israel, I wasn't sure which project did you say you'd worked on?
I worked on the African Women in Healthcare project.
Oh, you did work. Okay. For a minute, I thought you said you hadn't, and I was slightly confused. So when you were doing that project, did you have to? I mean, how much research did you do beforehand before you started thinking about what questions to ask?
I meant that I joined after all the filming was done. So I worked more on the video editing and the exhibition side of things.
So, okay, got you. So Christian, can I just ask you as well, in terms of I know that you were saying that the agency was in a sense with the interviewees, and I think that's interesting because obviously it's their story, but I also wondered to what extent in a way you need to know, or I'm asking you, I guess, what questions you would ask. I mean, like, if in terms of I'm just thinking in terms of my own research, I find that if I don't think carefully about what questions I ask, sometimes people forget to even mention certain things, So I was talking to somebody the other day and asked them, if they could remember when they had their passport, when they registered for their passport, and they couldn't remember. And I sort of tried to think of different ways of how they might have got their passport. And then, so I asked, well, have you ever traveled abroad? And they went, oh, yes, that's right. So when I traveled abroad in such and such date, that's when I had problems. And that's when I applied for my passport. And then he was able to explain the process. So I was just wondering, if in terms of when you're doing questions, do you think about the kind of problems that you're then going to face, maybe in terms of the issue of memory?
Sorry, I just need a second to think about that. Could you sort of elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, just that memory is such a difficult thing. A lot of people, especially something that's happened a long time ago, people can kind of maybe store it somewhere at the back of their head. So when you ask them the question, at that moment that you ask them that question, they don't know what the answer is. But if you can find a way of probing it, there are certain things that may trigger off a memory. So sometimes if there's something I really want to get to the bottom of, I prepare beforehand questions that can be asked in different ways and coming from different angles that might help to trigger off a memory.
Absolutely. Okay. I think I kind of get what you mean. From what we heard about the people that we're interviewing, some of the elderly ladies within the project, is that they were very happy to talk about their lives. For it was most likely the first time that they were asked to speak about them. And I think I guess what you kind of revealed is that sometimes missing out is, and looking within hindsight is also a benefit, because you have that opportunity to go back and expand and unravel the story a bit further, and also develop that relationship with the interviewee a lot better. So I guess in that sense, sometimes
I feel like we can always try very hard to include the best questions and make sure everything's prepared before we do the interview. But then I guess also there's kind of that beauty in oral history is the things that you miss out, and then trying to recover that and how that cultivates the relationship further and gives that person the agency of the story as well, to, I guess, illustrate their personality in a sense, because sometimes I think that's kind of the joy of oral history, that going back, that reveal. I think that's at least my perspective, because it is hard for them to properly remember things of the past as well. So
I always just think the whole issue of history is such an interesting question in terms of what they think is valuable history. Because quite often the interviewees will be telling you what they think you want to hear or what you value as history. And I guess it's the tension between what you as the interviewer want to hear about and what they want to share with you. But that's why I was just wondering about the approach, is if you were going into, when you do the projects, whether you're going in with an idea of what you want to get out of it, or whether you're going in purely as the idea that this is an interviewee, the story is about them, they've got the agency, and then you'll kind of more or less, rather than going in with sort of semi-structured interviews, going in kind of letting it flow in a much more fluid way.
Definitely. And I feel like that's kind of the approach that's been presented so far. I think as the conversation develops, it's more, as you say, letting the flow kind of run and not disrupting their experience or their perception of their experience to be, I guess, silenced in that sense. Because we can all want a certain outcome or someone to say a specific thing, but I think that kind of destroys the purpose of conducting that oral history. It may not be the answer that we want, but it is providing us with an important nuance and experience that hasn't been said before, regardless.
Can I ask both you and Isra as well about, oh, sorry, Isra, you wanted to respond, I think. You had your hand up. I didn't see it. Yeah.
I was going to say that for the African Women in Healthcare Project, a lot of the interviews were done in their homes, where they had like photo albums out on the table, or they were surrounded by family members. So they had these physical reminders that would help prompt conversation. If they forgot a certain detail, they could like go back through or take a minute to reorient themselves. And we wanted to hear about their whole story. So we would ask questions from the beginning, from their childhood to their migration stories, to their careers. And if there was a point that they were specifically excited about, then they would like spend longer on that topic, and we would like prefer to let them speak and let them get everything out into the interview. And then afterwards, we broke it up into themes. And then, afterwards, we would categorize everything rather than going in with a specific, like, rigid structure that you can't, like, have any leeway with. So a lot of the original interview files are quite long because they would be just speaking and sharing their stories in full.
How long would you actually spend with each person? I mean, was time an issue?
I don't think time was an issue in most of them. Some of them are think like over an hour-ish. And because of the pandemic, we had to do some of the interviews online via Zoom.
And I was just interested as well, now that you mentioned Zoom, about the generational differences. I mean, did some of the elders find it difficult dealing with the new technology?
In one of the clips that I showed, the first lady that spoke that arrived in 1959, she had her son helping her with everything and adjusting the angle and things like that. So yeah, they had help.
They had help, yeah. And then the other thing I just thought was really interesting is that obviously you're saying that most of the members of the Young Historians Project are either mixed heritage or from African or Caribbean backgrounds. But I always think in those situations, the issue of respect for elders is such a big thing. And so I wondered how what the dynamics were like in terms of the interviewers being younger and the you know, you're much younger than, say, the people that you were interviewing. How did that kind of affect the positionality?
I think they were just very receptive to YHP because they understood the importance of the project in teaching younger people and reaching a wider audience than they would have been able to if they were just like, for example, visiting a school, or because it's going to be on the internet and it's like a project with a wider reach that's like not boxed into like a museum exhibition that's like running for 1 year or something. It's on the internet forever, and we hope to share it for a long time. I think the atmosphere was like friendly and like more conversational rather than anything strict or anything about like being too formal or overly deferential to the interviewees.
Oh gosh, it's just slipped out of my mind. I was just thinking about how it may have affected the things that they shared, you know, because when you know your interview is going to be on the internet or somewhere for a long time and open to the public, you might be nervous about the kind of things that you share and the kind of story that you tell. And I was curious to see whether you felt people were more positive about their experiences with the NHS, whether they felt comfortable talking about how racism had impacted them, or whether they maybe wanted to downplay that. I mean, did you get any sense as to the kind of history that they wanted to share? Was it as a positive or a negative?
Because the women that we interviewed all came at like different intervals, some of the women that came later on had better experiences within their careers and with things like career progression or just like experiences with racism than the women who came earlier in the 50s and 60s. And they all had their own perspective and opinion on how bad like the racism was within the NHS. And some of them had really like difficult like stories to tell. And some of them didn't experience as much like difficulties. So I guess it just depended on the person.
Can I ask one last question before we go on? Only in that it wasn't, I don't think, answered when I asked it, because I was really interested in what happened to the original material in terms of when it's what happens to it in terms of the archive.
So with the exhibition panels and the materials from the Black Liberation Front project, I think it's all housed at the Black Cultural Archives. I'm not 100% sure, but I think for the other project, the African Women Project, I think it's housed at the British Library, the original transcripts and the files and everything. but we also have our own copies and backups of everything as well. So it's not just one person holding everything in an archive.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for that, for your presentation and for the discussion that you've just had. I'd like to take this opportunity now to bring in the other participants, the audience that we have. Thank you very much for your comments in the chat, and it's good to see some familiar faces, names at least, and some less familiar to me. If people have any questions or comments they'd like to put to any of our speakers, then please could you either indicate by raising your hand or letting me know somehow that you'd like to say something. Yes, Kate, hi.
Hi, I'm Kate from the IHR, but just in my own interest, I've done a bit of oral history with my family, and one of the things I did during the lockdowns was record people out in the environment where they grew up, and we walked around the places where they lived as a child, and we also did it online a bit as well, going around Google Street View and looking at places too. And I just wondered if anything like that has been done for any of the projects.
Okay. Does anybody have an immediate response to that, or should we take a few questions and then come back? What would you like to do?
I mean,
I was just taking.
I have, but yeah, Isra, go ahead.
I don't think we went on that kind of journey with the interviewees, because obviously it was difficult during the pandemic, and because of a lot of the things that they mentioned like didn't exist anymore. For example, one of the women worked in a hospital in Middlesex that's been like, I don't think it's in operation anymore. So because of the age of the interviewees and like the things, because they were looking back so far, we couldn't really physically access a lot of the things they were talking about. And because a lot of their stories involved migration and they had lived in different places across the UK, it was like quite difficult to kind of physically visit those places that they mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you, Isra and Kate, for your question. Nadia, you have a question.
Good evening, Christian and Israel. It's nice to see young historians keeping up the good work. Christian, I'm also at UCL. So I'm doing a master's in archives this year. I had two questions. Have you shared any of this work or gotten any volunteers from the students? You said you were undergrad history students with your cohorts at UCL. And secondly, I haven't had time to go through your entire website, but is the material deposited at the Black Cultural Archives or is it deposited somewhere else?
Okay. Christian or Isra, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you very much, Nadia. I just to answer the first one, I'm not a student at the University College of London, Isra is. So I think she could answer that question about some of the students in the cohort that work there.
My mistake, sorry.
No, it's fine, it's fine. Sorry for the confusion. And then I guess to answer the second question, so the physical panels that were part of that exhibition are stored in the Black Cultural Archives, but the documentary itself and the digital versions of the panels are accessible on our website under the headline, the Black Liberation Front. So you'll be able to get contextual information about the Black Liberation Front, the project itself, who's included in the project, the documentary that you can also watch, and the panels that would have been in the exhibition itself, but in a visual version. So it will also provide information that was included in the documentary. And that's all accessible on our website.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia, for your question. Are there any other questions or comments that people have?
Just to answer the question about where we get our recruits from, or if I've shared this with other students at UCL, we mostly get people wanting to join by reaching out to YHP online. So they've seen our Instagram page or our Twitter. So they usually just send an email or send a direct message. So I haven't had any experiences of people I've met at university wanting to join from me sharing what I do with YHP.
Thank you. I just saw a question or an offer of making a comment. Heather.
Okay. Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Sorry you can't see my face. My camera's not working. Don't know why. Technical limitations in me, I think. But I'd just like to thank Isra and Christian for their presentation. It's really interesting about hearing what's going on in London. I'm based in Yorkshire, and I'd like to perhaps ask a couple of questions very simply, and also offer a comment on the interviewing theme. And I've worked on a number of projects in West Yorkshire that have had different responses to the issue of interviewing. Sometimes we've worked on who's come forward as a volunteer, and those volunteers have all then been offered a little bit of background in all sorts of different aspects about oral history, and then been invited to take part in the interviewing. And fascinating things have come from involving interviewees talking across languages, talking across very different backgrounds of faith, ethnicity, race, history, geography, all sorts of gender. It's been really remarkable sometimes how people from very different backgrounds have found points in common that they could relate to. And I think Christian and Israel at different points have hinted about the issues, the significance of agency, of respect, of empathy. And from the projects that have been going on that I'm familiar with, those qualities can carry forward the power of an interview and unlock the sharing of stories and memories very, very effectively, and perhaps avoid people falling into that sort of narrow trap of thinking that, background is the only basis. It's a very, very important one, and it gives very particular resonances. It might build confidence, it might open up ways of talking, but it also, the diversity of backgrounds can also work very powerfully as well. So that was a comment. Sorry, it's rather lengthy. I have a question mark here about funding. How does it all happen? Because that's always so important for other groups to hear about. How does the money come forward to make it all possible? Because it sounds so impressive. And my third question is, have you ever done any work linking with groups outside London to help bring on others and inspire others? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Heather, for those questions and comments. Christian or Isra, do you want to pick those up?
Hi, Heather. So the question about funding, we apply for funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. And as for the question on if we work on groups outside of London, a lot of our members are actually outside of London. So they're based, some like university students based in like Nottingham, the Midlands, Bath, Bristol, Birmingham. And a lot of our work is done through Zoom. And we also try to like meet up in person sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to the second point, I think that's been a huge focus for us now, as like young historians that have been reading a lot of the scholarship on Black British history and the representation of Black British history within the media. So there have been many publications by members of the group about Black British history located outside of London. For example, discussions about experiences within Leamington Spa. I mean, some of the personal work that I'm working on within my university work that I hope to publish through the Young Historian Project and the History Matters Journal. And I think the Young Historian Project has been very encouraging for students like myself who are located outside of London, in areas such as Northamptonshire, the West Midlands, such as Birmingham, to engage with grassroots work and do a lot of field work when it comes to cultivating oral history or writing history about Black British history, encouraging us to be a bit expansive and understand that Blackness is not limited to one particular group, one particular identity or communities within a specific location. It can be found anywhere, everywhere. And as Israel mentioned, a lot of us come from different areas and we are representative of that experience. So I think it's been very encouraging and been a great foundation for a lot of students located outside of London to push forward on producing material about Black British history located outside of London. So it's been great, a great experience.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Juanita, for putting that reference in the chat on insider-outsider research and a kind of response to Heather's point that she was making in her points of with regard to the importance of having shared background, shared heritage, and the possibilities, opportunities that come from interviewing across different backgrounds. So I thought that was a useful comment in the chat. Siobhan, do you want to add to the point that you've just made in the chat? Are you able to? Are you still eating?
No. No, that went long ago. No, just, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about language and translation and we're writing some thoughts down today. So just, I mean, it's evident that point that, you know, there are times when, yeah, an insider is actually essential. I mean, I do think some people use interpreters for interviewing, but I don't think that would ever really be considered that successful, particularly in relation to oral history, for all the points that, you know, Christian and Isra have shared about supporting people to communicate and share their own stories. So yeah, but thank you both so much for sharing more about YHP's work. It's always really inspiring. You know, and I guess what I was wanting to ask you is, you know, you talked about in your presentation about the training you received in relation to interviewing and archiving and video editing, etc., filming and editing. And I wonder if you feel now as an organization, you're in a position where you might be able to provide training to others, or, you know, or is it at a point where I guess, you know, you can support yourselves with all of those skill sets, but yeah.
Thank you, Siobhan. Isra, Christian, do you want to come back on that?
I'm just taking a minute to think about it.
Yeah. There was a question earlier that I think Juanita asked about the kind of training that you've had with, I think you mentioned Black Cultural Archives and the nature of the training, but I think Siobhan's question takes it a stage further, and whether or not you yourselves have and the YHP have thought about developing, facilitating training.
And maybe it's not training as such, but just recognizing, I think that like you as a collective and as an organization have developed a unique set of expertise in relation to what you do. And that may be, you know, at times in the future of interest and of value to others, other collectives of young people at different stages of their journey. And I guess in relation to that, and thinking of you as collective, I was keen to understand how, like, the scale of YHP at the moment, and like if you could talk a little bit more about how people kind of engage over time. And because I understand you're volunteers and you're all busy, you know, that's also makes, you know, the outputs and the impacts of your outputs particularly impressive. You know, and it would be, that's different to, you know, some of us work in kind of more, you know, salaried contexts, whether that's within the kind of the voluntary sector or within academia. And it's a very different context that you're working in. And I think we should kind of, yeah, it'd be good to hear you talk a bit about that.
Thank you.
So the scale of YHP right now, I think we have around 30 members, 30 volunteers. And the way we structure it is that we meet twice a month over Zoom with everyone in one group to kind of share our research and updates about the work we're doing in like smaller groups, like usually like 2 to 3 or 4 people working on a smaller task within the wider project. And as for if we like would train outside groups, that's not a conversation we've had so far, but the training that we do is for the new volunteers that are joining and kind of catching them up to speed on our past projects or how we work or the communication streams and things like that. And I guess you could say the schools outreach we do is a kind of training, kind of teaching people about not just our projects, but about oral history and Black history and training them in that kind of way.
Thank you. Yeah, really great to hear that you're 30. That's quite a big club.
Yeah. I did want to say, I don't know if you've come across it, but the Oral History Society produced a couple of films for use in schools in conjunction with the Historical Association. And one of the things that I found quite useful was the way in which the Julia Letts, who produced the films, mapped oral history onto the existing school curriculum. So it was quite I thought quite an persuasive argument, a case that was made for using oral history in schools and not having to do it as a kind of sideshow, but actually part of the national curriculum. I can send you the link if you're interested in having a look at those videos.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Thanks.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I'll just slip one in if I may. I'm interested in terms of your own personal backgrounds, how you, given the fact that there must have been very few role models around in terms of promoting and encouraging you to become historians, was there a particular moment in your lives where you thought, yes, this is what I want to do? Or was it a kind of something that grew over time, your interest in history? Where did it come from?
I think for me, just to give a little background, I live in Northamptonshire. I've lived there since I was around about 8, and I've always loved studying history at school. And I think a pivotal moment was the creation of a Women of Colour Society by 6th form students within my school when I was around 17. And it was a great environment for them to talk about their experiences in relation to critical race theory. And I think that's the first time I kind of engaged with critical race theory. And to understand critical race theory, you need to know about Black history and then also Black British history. And it was just kind of upsetting to see a lot of backlash within the school itself, because it is a predominantly white institution in a predominantly white area. And they had to change their name and make it a bit more inclusive. And when that decision was made, it was kind of swept underneath the rug. And I think for me, it was kind of telling how the lack of critical race theory within the education system permeated, I guess, people's understanding or perception of history and the value of it, the value of people's experiences now. I think for me, I found it so hard to articulate to people within my school and my very close friends the importance of my experience and the people that have lived before me without having that foundation of reading Black history, first of all, and then also Black British history underneath that. And I think it's also I understand the value of going out and doing it yourself. But for the most part, if you're not presented, I guess just even the tiniest part of that thing, you wouldn't know that it's an important thing to consider or to research. And I found that when I came to university, that's the first time that I had that opportunity to really get to grips with writings about Blackness, particularly within the UK. And that was in my second year undergraduate module, which focused on race, migration, and politics within the UK. And it was led by Simon Pepler, if any people are familiar with him. And I struggled with the module quite a lot, but for me, it was less about the grade that I achieved and more about creating my own understanding of what it means to be Black for different people, for myself, and understanding how historical events have been huge and important to shaping their understandings and experiences of that, and how we can use the UK as a lens to understand Blackness. Because a lot of the previous examples have been very surface level, short, and also about the diaspora within America, which is an important history and example to consider. But it's important for people within the rest of the world to understand the value of Blackness and the history of how Black people have lived and have been treated. And I think history has been the most important aspect and should be the most important aspect through which people understand the identity and experience in the communities that are within this group and category. I guess that's just for me how I kind of became inspired and had that experience.
Yeah, that's a great account. Thank you, Christian. Isra.
For me, I've always just been really drawn to the humanities and the arts, but why I chose specifically history to do a degree in is I kind of felt like it was necessary for me to go on that kind of journey to understand my own identity and my own place as a British person that's also Black and from an immigrant family, because the kind of context back then was like Brexit, anti-immigrant sentiment in the media, Trump, kind of Islamophobia, and it kind of made me question where I belong or what my kind of place was in the UK, or how I felt like connected to British culture. And because I didn't get that kind of education in school about the history of Black people in the UK, I kind of wanted to kind of teach myself that. And I just found YHP online, and I was like really inspired because it showed a different way to be a historian. That's not just like being a teacher or being an academic. It's like working in a different way that's more grassroots, that felt more real to me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those really thoughtful accounts of your journeys into history. We're coming to the end of our allotted time. I don't know if anybody's got any last minute quick questions or comments they'd like to make. I mean, I would like to just, on behalf of the Society, really thank you both for coming, and thanks to Juanita too, for facilitating such a discussion. As I said at the beginning, I really hope that this is, I haven't met you before, and it would be really good for us to maintain this relationship that we've begun. For example, I'd really welcome an opportunity to keep you informed of any anything going on in the Oral History Society that you might be interested in. There are vacancies that crop up in terms of our training group, actually, and also our trustee board, that I'm very happy to send to you and encourage members, volunteers from YHP to apply for them. Joanna Bornat, who normally attends these events, is one of the editors of our journal, and I know if she were here, she would be encouraging you to the Oral History Journal. I should be encouraging you to submit anything that you've written or any of your projects you're writing up for publication, to submit it to the editorial board of the journal. And I'm sure that if you're interested, I can send you Joanna's details, and she'd be very happy to discuss with you and to receive anything from you. We're also using our website now to post shorter articles, sometimes sound recordings. So if there are particular sound recordings that you would like to post on the website, please get in touch with me, and I can forward them to our the people involved in running our website. We also have a blog section of the website, and if there was something that you wanted to put onto the blog, I'm sure that we'd be very happy to host that too. So that's really just an offer. If there are any things that we can do for the YHP, if there are any events that you would like us to publish, to put out on social media or on Twitter, in our newsletter, and then Facebook and so on, we'd be very happy to do that.
We greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Juanita, did you?
I just had one question, because I saw something that Abigail had put in the chat, and I wasn't sure if anybody had responded to it. She just had a question about the age group, and she was wondering why the age group has been set at 18 to 25.
You very briefly, because I've got to wind up now.
It's not like a strict limit of if you're over 25, you get booted out, but it's just trying to help people who may be like students or history students, like develop skills in history, or if they want to go on to work in heritage, trying to like develop and train young people specifically so they can go on to build their own projects or get further in their careers or their aspirations, that sort of thing.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was a question from Heather. Oh, and she's put, there are other editors. Yes, sorry, I was just referred to Joanna, Heather, because I know that she's part of the organizing group for the In Dialogue event, but of course, anybody can send any articles to any of the editors, and there are some in the audience. You also asked a question about the link, and I assumed you meant to me the link to the schools project, which I think Padmini very kindly has put in the chat. So if you're interested in the schools project, you can see the link there. Okay. Well, I will close the meeting now because we're just slightly over time. And thank you once again to our speakers for an excellent set of presentations and discussion, and also to the audience for your great questions and contributions. Thank you all, and I hope to see as many of you as possible at the next event, which will be certainly sending to the YHP to publicise, and for those of you from the OHS, we'll certainly be putting it out in our communication shortly. Thank you, everybody.